All right, great to see so many people on Zoom and in the room today. I'll start us off with some introductions and then turn it over to our candidate. My name is JD. I'm a professor of higher education, and I had the great honor to serve as the chair of Greg's dissertation committee. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Willis Jones, who serves as the third reader on Greg's dissertation committee. Dr. Jones is at Southern Methodist University and is an expert on matters related to college athletics and all things financial. And I'm also delighted to acknowledge Dr. Monica Chan, who is a faculty member in our department in the higher education program. And Dr. Chan serves as the second reader for Greg's committee. We'll turn it over to Greg for his presentation today. Following the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion, first with the committee members, and then time permitting from the audience members as well. So, Greg, on that note, I'll turn it over to you for the presentation.
That's great. Thanks, Jay. Thanks to everyone in Zoom land. You're right here. Thank you. And thank you for everyone that was able to make it today. Appreciate it. So to begin, I'm going to give a quick synopsis of the entire study, just so you know going in what's happening. But if you don't catch everything, it's okay. We're going to cover it for the next, hopefully 40 minutes, possibly longer. So to begin, this study examines the impact of an NCAA policy change. In 2015, the NCAA allowed some institutions to begin paying student athletes for the very first time via a system called cost of attendance. Now, there's a prior study that found at institutions with top-level football programs, and specifically Power 5 programs, that the policy change led to significant increases in the cost of attendance. Now, larger costs of attendance might enable teams to offer their recruits more money and therefore attract better players and perform better on the field. The larger cost of attendance also enable all students at the institution to borrow student loans at higher rates, since the cost of attendance serves as a ceiling to what students can borrow. So therefore, this study investigates the following two questions. Did schools at the next level down on the hierarchy of higher education, the group of 5 conference members, also increase their cost of attendance? And question 2, did students at the top level, Power 5 conference members, where we found cost of attendance increased, was there higher student loan borrowing there? And lastly, this study analyzes the data by comparing each group of schools, the Power 5 and the group of 5, to a control group that did not experience this policy change, specifically the Division II schools, and it's going to be using some econometric methodology. So that's the study in a nutshell. We're going to go into a lot more detail if you didn't catch any of that, okay? Next, we're going to talk about the cost of attendance, because clearly that's the center of this study. The cost of attendance is a number that's just calculated by every financial aid office across the country, and it's composed of 5 pieces: tuition, fees, room, board, and this 5th thing called miscellaneous expenses. And what you might realize right away is that 4 of those things probably sound familiar. They're billed expenses that schools put on students' bills when they show up on campus in the fall. You can look those numbers up. It's very clear where those numbers come from. But then there's this last piece called miscellaneous expenses. And what exactly is that number? The Title IV Federal Aid Handbook defines it as, quote, an allowance for books, supplies, transportation, and miscellaneous personal expenses. This can include a reasonable amount as determined by your school. So this number is basically fabricated. It's a fake number that each school gets to come up with their own methodology to compute. And you can imagine some schools may do it one way, other schools may do it a different way, so it can vary significantly. Now, the size of the cost of attendance also functions as a ceiling on total financial aid, specifically scholarships, grants, work study, and loans. So in my prior career as a financial aid counselor, a lot of parents would borrow a huge student loan, not knowing what those costs of higher education are. And it would be my job to trim that big number that they borrowed down to fit within the cost of attendance. That was quite common. So the cost of attendance, again, serves as a cap on how much a student can borrow. I want to drill this down really concretely, because you have to understand this to understand the rest of the study. Here's a hypothetical example just to get the numbers kind of clear. Let's just take a hypothetical student athlete whose tuition and fees is 20,000, 10,000, and their room and board is 15,000. So when this student athlete shows up on campus, their bill to pay for school would be for 45,000. And let's just say that their miscellaneous expenses is 5,000. That's what the school has calculated as those type of out-of-pocket expenses. And their overall cost of attendance would be 50,000 in this case. Now, before 2015, the very best athletes in the country, the quarterbacks, the linebackers at the top schools, they would have gone a full ride. You know, that's always the dream, right? They would have gone a scholarship for $45,000, which would be great. That means when they show up on campus, their bill's 45,000 and they don't owe the school a penny. But you have this little issue where the school has calculated what is a more accurate representation of what the cost is. And for this student athlete, despite being the top athlete in the country, you know, the Joe Burrows of the world, the Johnny Manziels, they'd have to borrow $5,000 to cover what the school acknowledges are realistic expenses. And this is the heart of the policy change. This is the idea that the policy change is the idea that instead of making these student athletes borrow money, they would get a stipend. We could pay these athletes up to the cost of attendance. It wouldn't have to be the full amount, but we could finally pay student athletes just a little bit to cover those out-of-pocket expenses, like think about either their books or traveling home on holidays or their laundry, all those type of things that students have to pay for out of pocket. So that's cost of attendance in a nutshell. I also want to cover, before we really get into the meat of the study, college athletics, because I know we're up here in New England, college athletics is not as big as it is in other parts of the country. So you have to understand how college athletics is structured in order to understand how the study operates. So very briefly, the way college athletics is organized is very hierarchical. There's schools at the very bottom and there's schools at the very top. And the higher up you go, the more prestigious, the more money that is in play. These are the top schools. I'm going to start at the very top of the pyramid. These are the schools you probably recognize, are on TV all the time. I counted it this morning. 11 of the Sweet 16 schools that are playing this weekend are represented here. So this is very much representative of the best of the best. And these are referred to, I'll be talking about them throughout the study, as the Power 5 conference schools. You can see the logos for their conference on the left-hand side, the Big Ten, the SEC, the Big 12, the ACC, and the Pac-12. That's how all these schools are organized into conferences that compete amongst each other. So this is the very top of the pyramid, and you can kind of see that represented here. They are part of what's called the football bowl subdivision, and what kind of differentiates them, besides the fact that they have television networks paying them hundreds of millions of dollars, is that they, at this time, were able to offer what they call full head count scholarships. They could offer 85 of these scholarships, which means, as in my example, their scholarship covered all of their billed expenses. Right below them is another group of conferences that are bundled together and called the Group of Five. And this is the Mountain West, the MAC, Sun Belt, Conference USA, and the American. Very similar. They had 85 headcount scholarships that they could offer their players. Only difference is they didn't have the big television contracts that the Power 5 had, much less. And these are going to be the two treatment groups that we have throughout this study. So I'm going to constantly refer to P5, G5. So just so you know at the outset. Now they are within Division I, and there's another group. Again, I'm starting at the top and working my way down. There's another group of conferences and schools called the Football Championship Series, the FCS. I'm not going to talk about them today. But I'll note that the big difference here is we go from 85 full scholarships to 63 what they call equivalency scholarships. So keep in mind a football roster in college is usually about 100 players. And those 63, what they call equivalency scholarships, they would usually spread out among their players. So not everyone would get a full ride, I sort of say. Then at the very bottom of this chart is Division II. These are all the conferences and of course the schools that are within them. And what's important about them is the policy that we'll be talking about didn't impact them. They were not eligible. And also these schools were only able to award 36 equivalency scholarships. So it's just an example of how the higher up the pyramid you go, the more resources there are, the more prestige there is. Okay. And I'm sorry, the Division II schools will serve as our comparison. So we're going to be comparing the schools in the Power Five and the Group of Five and comparing them to the Division II schools in this study. Okay, so we've gone over cost of attendance, we've gone over college athletics and how it's organized. I want to talk a little bit about college athletics broadly so you have some contextual information. This is Mark Emmert, the president of the NCAA at the time of the study. And he said, quote, "I am adamantly opposed to the notion of paying student athletes to play their games." And this is the traditional perspective on college athletics until very recently. This kind of represents the idea that was commonly held that college athletics is supposed to be amateur sports, that these players are only going through this process to get a good education. They're not there to be professional athletes. And that if they were to be paid, that would completely destroy college athletics. This was a view very widely held, not just by people in power in college athletics, but the public broadly believed this as well. I'll just point out that this is despite the fact that college athletics, even in 2015, was generating billions of dollars in revenue. So that's what was the commonly held view of college athletics at the time. Let me talk a little bit about the policy change. So in January of 2015 is when the NCAA approved what's called cost of attendance stipends. And that's what I showed you earlier when you've got that little difference between the cost of attendance and what the student's bill is. That little, in this example, $5,000 difference, the NCAA said, schools, you're allowed to pay players up to that cost of attendance. They didn't have to, or we'll talk about that, but they didn't have to go all the way up, but they could offer it finally. Excuse me. Now at the Power Five level, again, at the very tippity top of the pyramid, those schools all were required to award these cost of attendance stipends. So they immediately, as I'll show, started awarding these cost of attendance stipends. But interestingly, and this is very critical for my first research question, at the Group of Five and FCS level, they could opt in to awarding cost of attendance stipends. They were not required. So some schools decided to award them right away in 2015. Some of them decided to wait a year, see what would happen. Would college athletics blow up? They waited a year. Some waited even longer. So that's going to be a key piece of this study. And then just to reiterate, Division II level schools were ineligible to award these stipends. So that's why they are our comparison. So at the start of the 2015-2016 football season, this was the big change. This was the thing that was supposed to destroy college athletics, that players would finally be compensated. Again, we're talking just a few $1,000s, which is funny to think about today when we are paying quarterbacks millions and millions of dollars directly from the schools. You just think about 11 years ago, this was the big thing to pay players just a few $1,000s. And it speaks to one, we'll get into a lot of what that speaks to, but how much has changed is certainly one of them. Now, one thing I want to talk about very quickly is how if you think about what we've gone over so far, how schools at the very tippity top that want to outperform each other, how they would have responded to this policy. Because if you're starting to pay players and you're only bound by a cost of attendance, what happens if the cost of attendance goes up? Suddenly you're able to pay players a lot more than otherwise, right? So there could be some motivation if schools want to compete. If they want to get the best players, they have to pony up. And so there could be some changes to the cost of attendance if schools really wanted to compete with each other. And this was not lost on some people, notably Coach Nick Saban, 7-time national championship coach. He pointed out in 2015, quote, "If you leave it up to the institution," and I think some people have manipulated their cost of attendance numbers, because they've significantly changed from last year to this year, and that's not the spirit of the rule. Now, what's interesting about this quote is what he's focused on. He is focused on schools competing with each other. He's very much concerned that some coaches could get an advantage over the other in recruitment. He's not concerned that schools are going to be spending significant amount of money to pay for these cost of attendance stipends. He doesn't care about the cost. He's concerned about the competition because, he's a great coach and he doesn't want any competition outside of what happens on the field. So keep that in mind. Now, again, this wasn't lost on anybody, and in fact, somebody did a great research study on this very issue, this concern, and I'm very lucky to have him with me today. Dr. Willis Jones is my third reader. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Jones. He's at Southern Methodist University. He did a great study in 2022 on this exact question. His research question: did universities in the Power Five increase their cost of attendance because of the change in this policy? And much to Coach Saban's delight, he found a statistically significant increase. There was, in fact, a change. Schools did show that they wanted to increase their cost of attendance in order to award the larger stipends and recruit the best players. But there's this interesting thing with statistics, where you can have a statistically significant finding and a practical finding that is not exactly the same. So Dr. Jones notes in his own study that the average increase to cost of attendance was a mere $260, which I would suggest does not mean that college athletics is ruining higher education, that the cost is going to spiral out of control, that it's not exactly the end of the world that was projected. Excuse me one second. Now, like all good researchers, Dr. Jones in his study left behind some nuggets for future researchers such as myself to follow up, and that's what I'm doing today. My research questions, again, did schools at the group of five level, again, not the Power Five, the next level down, did those schools also increase their cost of attendance like the higher tier schools? And if we understand cost of attendance as a cap on student loan borrowing, and Dr. Jones found that the cost of attendance increased, did the student loan debt also increase? That's research question 2. Okay, we've gone over a lot already. We're going to start going into what's called the conceptual framework, how I understand what's going on here, basically. We're going to start with Professor and Dr. Howard Bowen, former economist, college president, that came up with what's called the Bowen's Law. It says the dominant goals of institutions are educational excellence, prestige, and influence. Now, this is fascinating to me because it dispels the common idea of higher education as being about making better people, educating people, making the world a better place. Dr. Bowen recognized that higher education is nothing more than a rat race. It's a rat race that's ruthlessly fought between institutions who are fighting over prestige and excellence. And he found and believes that in the quest of excellence, prestige, and influence, there is virtually no limit to the amount of money an institution can spend for seemingly fruitful educational needs. And so schools will raise as much money as possible, and they will spend as much money as possible to those ends. And the net effect of that is that the cost of higher education goes up. And I think given where we are today, you look at how much the cost of higher education has gone up, I think his view is correct. And it also is pretty easy to, even though he was speaking about higher education broadly, I think it applies to college athletics as well. We hear all the time about how schools are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to compete at the very top level. And to do that, in order to succeed, they're willing to spend all that money. And sometimes we ask ourselves, why are they doing that? And I think Bowen's Law speaks to that. I also utilized Professor Carrie Ann O'Mara's Striving institutional theory. Now, she basically took Bowen's Law and, as I would say, apply that at the subunit level. So how does enrollment management, how does the registrar, how does faculty, how do they feed into the system of looking to acquire prestige? And has all these different ways to analyze the motivations and the indicators of striving. So these are the conceptual frameworks that is the basis for my study. Now I want to very quickly go over the research literature that I covered in my study. Number one, college athletics spending and the Flutie effect. If you're not familiar with Doug Flutie, former quarterback at Boston College, very famously beat Miami in 1984 in the Orange Bowl. And the next year, Boston College saw a 16% increase in applications. And so you hear this all the time from athletic departments and from institutions that spending in college athletics is justified if we can see on the other end some increase in enrollment. You know, if only your school can win the national title, you're going to see that same change in your enrollment. So that's a big part of my research, my literature review. I would say that the empirical analysis of that is a bit mixed, if that's truth or myth. Another part of my literature review was just overall costs and what is the relationship between spending on top tier Power 5 college athletics and the overall cost of higher education. And again, I would say this is a contested space. The findings are a bit mixed, but I will point out Dr. Jones was part of a study from 2020 that found that there was no relationship between spending on college athletics and the overall cost of higher education. There was some research literature on the cost of attendance that's in my paper. Kelching, Goldrick, Grab, and Haas did a great paper that looks at schools that are next to each other, like BU and BC, and analyzes the miscellaneous expenses piece of the cost of attendance and compares them. Why would it cost more out of pocket for one of those schools over the other since they live next to each other? And there's some really great analysis there that I reviewed in my paper. I'll also point out the cost of attendance stipend. I'm not the first one to review this policy change and look at how it impacted different parts of college athletics. There was a great paper that looked at its impact on recruitment, on how revenue was drawn from male non-revenue sports and used to fund these stipends. So there's been other studies that have looked at this policy change. And lastly, of course, I looked at some of the research literature on student loan debt. I'll just point out that I focus primarily on the institutional predictors of student loan debt, not individual, which is a bit different, because my study, of course, is looking at the institutions. So this is my literature review in about a minute. And now I don't want to just suggest that this policy that I'm studying is the biggest change in the history of college athletics. In fact, just in the last 5-10 years, the entire landscape of college athletics has had nothing short of a revolution. And very, very briefly, I'll just say we've seen conference realignment where those historical and traditional conferences have been broken as schools look to climb and get more of that television revenue, and shifting conferences that's destroyed college athletics in many ways. The NCAA versus Alston case, you know, it warms my heart that in a time of political divide, that our Supreme Court just 5 years ago could come together and in a 9-0 decision unanimously agreed to go against the NCAA. I thought that was very heartwarming. Major policy change there. There was a change to allowing student athletes to start profiting off of their name, image, and likeness, which has flooded the market with players doing sponsorships and signing autographs and selling products and what have you. The transfer portal, I would say, is probably the biggest change. Prior to this policy change, if an athlete wanted to move schools, they would have to sit out a year. And that, as a result, not many players would transfer. But now, the current policy is that a player can transfer and play immediately. And so we've seen a massive change in how players are going through college, as some players have transferred 7 or 8 times in their college career. It's been a big change. And lastly, the House settlement, which happened last fall, which initiated a salary cap and revenue sharing between the schools and the players. So this is Judge Claudia Wilkins. She was the presiding judge on the House case, the Alston case, and the O'Bannon case in 2011. So depending on your perspective, she's either the hero or the villain of college athletics and student athlete empowerment. Okay. All right, so we've gone over the research questions, the literature, the conceptual framework. You might finally be wondering, what the heck is it that I did? That's a fair question. Okay, so I have done what's called an econometric methodology called difference in difference. And the way that this methodology works, fundamentally at the highest level, is having a treatment group, a group of schools that experienced a policy change, and a comparison group that didn't have, was not impacted by the policy change. So again, our treatment group is the Power 5, group of 5, that's the green on the chart, and our comparison group is the yellow. And so what you're seeing here is those two groups measured by some dependent variable, in this case, the cost of attendance or student loan debt, and we're watching how they behave across time, left to right. And you see in the middle of the chart, the red line, and that is the policy change. That's the cost of attendance stipends being awarded. What hopefully catches your eyes is in the pre-treatment period, you're seeing both groups move in parallel to each other. That's very critical. It's not that these two groups have the same amount of student loan debt or that their cost of attendance is the same. What's absolutely fundamental is that they are moving across time in the pre-treatment period in the same way, in parallel. And because of that, we can see this dotted green line. We can presume we know what would have happened in a world where this policy change didn't happen. But because something happened that affected just one group, we can see the observed change, which gives us this little space to measure an outcome effect. And that's how we do the difference in difference analysis. But obviously, what's very crucial to this methodology is what's called the parallel pre-trends. And that's, again, just the assumption that these two groups would have moved in parallel had the policy not happened. So I'll be, in each research question, I'll be doing a visual analysis of the outcome variable, and I'll be doing what's called an event study as well. Okay, so that is the methodology. But fun thing about this study, which I tried to allude to, is what happens if the treatment is staggered. And what that means is, remember, the group of 5 schools could opt into the policy. They weren't required to do it. So some schools started awarding the stipend in 2015, some awarded in 2016, some later on. So that was a staggered, what they called staggered treatment effect. So that kind of changes a little bit about that picture that I showed before. What do you do in that case? And funny thing about it, even though this methodology is over 100 years old, only recently has someone thought about that, because before 2020, no one would have cared. It would have just been thrown in the same regression model, been a straightforward two-way fixed effects, wash your hands clean, be done, very standard. But in 2020, a lot of academics and scholars started looking into this, and there was a revolution in how to handle these situations. And there are lots of different ways to calculate the treatment effect, and I'm going to go over the one that I picked. The one I picked is called the group time average treatment effect, which was created by Callaway and Santana. So needless to say, it's going to get a lot more complicated before we're done, but just know that I chose either the very best or the very worst time to do this study. I'll let you decide. So I have my opinions. I'm going to try my best to visualize what that new estimation model is. What you're seeing on this table is from left to right, the two groups. Again, remember, in the group of 5 schools, some of them adapted the stipends in 2015, some adapted in 2016. So what you're seeing here is a row for each of the groups, and you're seeing a column for each of the pre-treatment for every year. And you can see as we move through the pre-treatment periods in 2011, 12, 13, 14, you see a red line where the policy change happens, and then we're starting to see the treatment effects of the policy change. And you can see in tan that the 2015 group, that's when they implemented, but critically, the ones that adapted in 2016 still had a extra pre-treatment year. Okay, that's important. And then you see at the end here, a row for the control group. They never experienced the policy change, so you don't see a treatment effect. Okay, so this is broadly what's happening. How does this methodology handle it? This is kind of just visually reiterating what we already know. Well, there's lots of different ways you can calculate a treatment effect. You could just look at each group individually. So we could answer the question, what was the impact of the policy on just the schools that implemented in 2015? What is the impact on the group of schools that just implemented in 2016? We can look at, was there a difference between the two? That's what this is representing, is we can see what happened to each group. But depending on the policy, we might be interested in looking at it from a calendar, from a time perspective. We might want to ask ourselves, what was the impact of the policy in just 2016? Not looking at any other years. And if we were to look at just 2016, we'd be looking at the second treatment period for the 2015 group and the first treatment period for the 2016 group. So that's another way that this methodology, allows you to analyze it. Lastly, there's the other way to estimate a treatment effect is to synchronize when the treatment occurred, and then you look at it from a event, what they call an event study perspective. And that's just saying, if you want to answer the question, what was the impact of the policy in year one? What was the overall treatment effect? And so you're seeing that on this first row here, you're getting the first treatment period, but it ignores the chronology of what's happening here. And the net effect of all of this basically is to say that there are different ways to measure a treatment effect. And I'm going to be performing all of these in order to increase the robustness of my analysis and make sure that whatever findings I may or may not have are not sensitive to one specific model decision. So this is the latest research methodology that I was fortunate enough to come along for. Okay, so we're going to get into it now. Research question one. Again, research question one is looking at the group of 5 schools and whether or not the cost of attendance went up for these schools. And the treatment group, again, is our group of 5 conferences. And I'll just say a bit more about how I chose which schools, because there's some funny things happening during the period of study. Conference realignment is constantly happening in college athletics. So you had schools that would enter into the group of 5 during the period of study, and there would be some that would leave. And I required that there be stable membership. I didn't want the schools that were coming and going. I also required stable program operations. So some schools, their programs were suspended or began the period of study, so I did not include them. Of course, I required that they offered the cost of attendance stipend, and I excluded the service academies because they're their own ball of yarn. And just to reiterate again, the comparison group is the Division II schools. Remember, these are schools that do have football programs. They do offer scholarships, so there is a lot of similarity, but they were not eligible for the cost of attendance stipends, which is why they're the perfect comparison. And also what Dr. Jones did in his study. Okay, so let's get into the model itself. You can see the Greek equation if you'd like. I'm going to skip over that. I won't read that to you, but I will say briefly what it represents. Again, just remember, we're comparing those group of 5 schools to the Division II schools. We're looking at the cost of attendance, and we're doing the analysis both at or including the group level, the time level, and the event study level. So we're going to be doing all types of models, and we're going to run it both what they call conditionally and unconditionally. So there were some covariates that Dr. Jones used in his analysis. These are all from his paper. So I am running the models with these covariates and without, conditional and unconditional, just to have, again, the most robust analysis possible, so that any findings that I may or may not have, we can look to see, was it sensitive to the specific specification. Okay, now let's get into the parallel pre-trends analysis. This is, again, remember that chart with the green and the yellow. that part where they're in parallel together. I'm just focusing on that piece. And these are what are called event study graphs. You can see the vertical green lines. And what's happening here is that each pre-treatment year is comparing the treatment and control group in that specific year to the final pre-treatment year. And the basic idea is to show visually with a simple regression, is there a difference between the groups? Because we don't want that. We want them to be moving in parallel to each other. So the basic idea is if these lines intersect the dotted black line, the 0, it's good. And fortunately, in this analysis, that is what was found, both in all what they call different inference procedures, both as outcome regression, doubly robust, and inverse propensity weights. So basically, what this is showing is that I have demonstrated to the best of my ability that the parallel pre-trends assumption was met for research question 1, and we can move forward with the difference in difference. Now, I also did the event study analysis in the post-treatment periods, these black lines. And this is where, in contrast to the parallel pre-trends assumption, we would actually want to see these lines not intersect the dotted lines. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that is not the case. So just as a preview, we are not finding, from an event study perspective, any statistically significant impact based on the policy here. Okay, every researcher has that table that they're proud of. Here's mine. A lot of numbers. Again, this is just reflecting all of those different models that I spoke about. I won't go through all of them, but I will point out what I'm sure some people are noting is that there's no asterisks anywhere, right? There's no statistically significant findings. I was not able in any of my models to find a statistically significant impact of the cost of attendance stipend policy on the cost of attendance. I'll note that these are the conditional models. There's a whole nother table of unconditional models where that was also the case. And these are only the outcome regression. Again, there were 3 calculation methods. So there's a lot more tables, but I'm just letting you know that none of them have any asterisks anywhere. I want to focus on one of the models because I think I should at least explain one of them, and certainly the group specific to me is the most intuitive. So what these results are focused on is looking at each group of schools, the ones that implemented in 2015 and the ones that implemented in 2016. So what this is saying is that the 44 schools that implemented the cost of attendance stipend in 2015, there was on average a negative 2.5% difference in the cost of attendance. But again, you're not seeing any asterisks there critically. So that's what was found for that group. In 2016, there were the 7 schools that implemented then had a 4.6% increase in the cost of attendance. So I'll point out the standard errors, as you can see here, of 0.03 and 0.05 are larger than the treatment effects. If you think of that event study graph, those bars were pretty large. That's really noticeable. I want to note that the confidence intervals for both treatment effects here are large. The 2015 group is from negative 8% to positive 3%, and the 2016 group is from -5 to positive 15, which shows that the effect is not the tightest null effect, that there is noise here, but that I can confidently rule out any large, massive effect, the type that was forewarned by Coach Saban and others. But it's not a specific enough null effect to demonstrate that there wasn't any impact of the policy, but there certainly wasn't a huge impact of the policy. Okay, we're through with research question 2. I know I'm going along. Research question 2, we're going to move to that. And just to refresh you, we're looking at the Power 5 conference schools. Those are the ones at the tippity top of college athletics. Again, these are the schools. We're going to look at the impact of the policy on student loan borrowing because, again, Dr. Jones found that the cost of attendance went up. It didn't go up that much. Remember, just $260, but it did go up. So we're going to follow up and see, did student loan borrowing go up at these schools? Again, here's the Greek formula. If you'd like, I'm not going to read it to you. I'll go through the pieces though. Student loan debt is interesting. There's not one variable to say this is student loan debt. There's different metrics, and I included them all, of course, to be as robust as possible. This is a two-way fixed effects regression model with fixed effects for the individual institution and one for the conference. I also have fixed effects for overall treatment effects and individual year coefficients. And for the covariates of the model, I drew from that research literature around institutional predictors of student loan debt. That's where all these come from, and those are the ones I threw into the model when we ran conditional models. And again, I'm looking at the parallel pretrends assumption. I'm going to start here and see if I can demonstrate parallel pretrends before I can possibly move to the next phase. And what you're seeing is this is the average federal student loan debt outcome. You can see in the treatment and control group what the actual values are for each pretreatment year on the table on the left. And then you can see that visualized, where you can kind of eyeball here on this chart. Yeah, these two lines look in parallel to each other. You could say that. But I went further and ran the event study. Again, you see these large vertical green lines, and they intersect the zero line, which is what you want. But I do want to say there were some models that this was not the case. In the interest of time, I'll just say in those instances, I took a subsample through different matching algorithms to better match the comparison in control group and continue on, so I could still use these dependent variables and continue the analysis. But I don't want to mislead you and think that for 40 models, I was able to meet the parallel pretrends assumption. Okay, gonna look at some more results and some very pretty tables. What you see here is the outcome in the conditional model for the average other student loan debt. Those are primarily parent co-signed loans. And you see the treatment effect, the overall treatment effect when I ran that model, and the year specific ones here in green. Now, very quickly, you'll see that, again, there's no asterisks, so there was no statistically significant impact on this outcome. But I do want to say there were some that did have effects. Given that there were 40 models that were ran, that would be expected. When you run that many different models, you would expect to find some statistical significance, and it happened 5 times. But given the lack of overwhelming evidence of an impact to student loan debt and the sensitivity of the outcome to the specific model choices, there is not clear evidence of a real impact of the stipend policy to student loan debt based on my findings. Okay, I'm gonna go back to that quickly. Yeah, that's just reinforcing. Yeah, I ran 40 different models. Again, I was able to find 5 times where there was statistical significance across all those models. Okay, we're through the 2 questions. I'm going to wrap up, Jay, I swear. Research question 1, no statistically significant findings. Research question 2, 5 of the 40 models with significant findings. Now, there could be some issues with my research design. No research design is perfect. There could be issues with absorption, heterogeneity, and measurement. Specifically thinking about the time horizon I chose for the study, or the statistical power that you can have when you're talking about so few schools. But broadly, there are null findings across both research questions. And I'm going to connect this to the existing literature that I reviewed at the start. We know that the average Power 5 school has on average $102 million athletic department budget, and the Group of 5 has on average a $31 million budget. And this study suggests that the Group of 5 didn't have the resources to keep up with the Power 5. I'm sure there was ambition to continue to increase the cost of attendance and compete, but there may not have been the availability of resources. The research on potential increases to costs, this study did not detect the forewarned increases to costs, because if there were stipends we know stipends were awarded in the Group of 5, so we know costs went up, but we didn't see that. We didn't find that statistically significantly in the results. The cost of attendance, the study did not detect the relationship between increasing cost of attendance and student loan debt. Again, Dr. Jones found that statistical increase, but not significant, not practically significant, and I didn't find any for loan debt. Dr. Bowen's law, I think there are several issues there. Even though he predicted schools would do everything to compete, there are inevitably financial realities that have to be faced at these schools. And so eventually there's a limit to what schools can do when they're bound by financial realities. O'Mara, in her Striving Institutional Theory, I think this goes to the fact that financial aid, who calculates the cost of attendance, and athletics are different parts of a university. Universities are very complex, and each of those subunits has its own culture, its own practices, and this would have been a real disagreement. You can imagine Coach Saban calling the financial aid office and how that would have gone. I think O'Mara would speak to that. So what does this study say about the broader student athlete compensation and rights issue? This study could be seen as one of the first rigorous empirical tests, along with Dr. Jones, of the NCAA's opposition to player compensation. This study accepted the negative warnings that were told that opposed student athlete compensation, that cost of attendance and student loan debt would go up, and tested those ideas. The study found that compensating student athletes did not have those foretold effects. The cost of attendance did not go up, student loan debt did not go up. So now the models aren't perfect. The treatment effect estimates aren't as precise as we would want, but any large, massive effects that we were forewarned about can be ruled out. So what can we take from that? Well, today we hear a lot about how players are making too much money. There's college athletes right now who are getting paid millions of dollars, and that players have no loyalty to their school and are transferring and have no loyalty to their team, and that the player rights movement has gone too far. But I would say maybe we should start questioning the people in power who say those things, because many of those people saying those things now were saying the same things in 2015. And when we look back at it, our dear friend, Coach Saban, he has similar thoughts today as he did then. Here's Coach Saban. He has since retired and sits at the biggest platform in college football on College Game Day. And here he is at the college athletics roundtable that President Trump had just a few weeks ago. And just recently he said this. He said, quote, "I think the big mistake that people make is college athletics is not a business. People say it's a business, but it's not really a business. It's revenue producing and nobody takes a profit. All the money gets reinvested in other opportunities for other people, whether it's facilities, whether it's scholarships, whether it's opportunities for people to play." And I find this to be a very interesting quote, because remember, he says nobody takes a profit. And this is the man that has earned over $150 million in career earnings, which I would suggest that someone is making a profit from all this. So as we move forward and debate the SCORE and SAFE Act, and we continue to fear the inevitable formation of some type of super league, we argue over whether we should give the NCAA an antitrust exemption, and we consider if we should amend the Sports Broadcasting Rights Act, and whether or not student athletes should be collectively bargained, and whether or not they should be employees. Maybe it's time to stop giving credence to those who've been making these same negative forecasts for over a decade. We should stop believing that compensating players and giving them a seat at the table will destroy college athletics. Maybe it's time to move past these false warnings and continue to empower players through policy, through litigation, or if need be, collective bargaining, so that they can continue to have a seat at the table. That's my study. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Thank you, friends, family, and especially my wife, Megan, and parents for being here. And of course, my committee. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, and congratulations on reaching this stage in the process. It's just wonderful to be here with friends, family, colleagues from across your professional career. So again, congratulations. And I will say that the amount of change that occurred while you were doing this study is probably unprecedented for a lot of doctoral students, because not only did the context of college athletics change dramatically during the course of your study? And you all might know there's no longer a Power Five, it's the Power Four now because the Pacific 12 Conference disbanded. They went elsewhere to find more money. So it's not even the Power Five anymore. It's the Power Four, and there's so much other change going on that you mentioned, Greg, with respect to name, image, and likeness and compensation. So the landscape shifted dramatically during your study. Not to mention the landscape around the methods that you used changing dramatically since the outset of your study. So I definitely commend you for dealing with both of those seismic shifts in what you were studying and how you were studying it. So greatly appreciate that.
Thank you.
In terms of questions and discussion, I'll turn it over first to Dr. Chan, and then we'll hear from Dr. Jones in just a little bit. Dr. Chan?
Congratulations, Greg. It's been a really great pleasure, I think, to both learn with and from you on this study, and I hope that you take time to celebrate just getting here. I know that it was a big lift. So I have some questions. I think that's my job, being here on the committee. So, I have 3 questions. And my first question is, I'm thinking a lot about your findings and sort of the different groupings that happen across all of your different research questions. So for example, right, the focus on the group of 5 in research question 1 and your findings in contrast to Dr. Jones's findings. And I think you do a nice job here sort of helping us think about generalizability and how, the G5 institutions might be different from the P5 institutions. And that makes me think a little bit about your second research question and the matching groups, where you do find some significant effects. And I wonder if you could walk us through the subsamples, which I realize, you didn't have time to do here, but in the paper you do, and just walk us through a little bit more substantively about who's in those subsamples. Do you think that could explain some of the significant findings that you have? And what are the implications of that for generalizability for your findings?
Sure. It's a great question, Dr. Chan. Thank you. I believe, again, I spoke about it briefly, but happy to take more time to talk about it. There were some models where the parallel pre-trans assumption was not met. And in those circumstances, what I did is use what's called optimal match, as you know, because you read the paper, optimal match and nearest neighbor matching. That basically takes you have a treatment group and you take a subset of those schools that best match some schools in the control group to make a sample that will hopefully meet the parallel pre-trans assumption. And looking at them, I believe 3 out of the 5 times that I found statistically significant findings were those subsamples. I think that speaks to how, these schools are all so diverse, right? The heterogeneity of the outcome variables and really who these schools are makes it hard to make a comparison, but by the basis of the method of matching the subsample, I think it speaks to when you do that and you find a subsample, it's more, you're going to have a more apples to apples comparison because you're looking at the way these specific schools changed in the outcome. So considering that not only, but 3 out of the 5 outcomes were from those, I think it speaks to, the generalizability because it's not all schools that saw that statistically significant finding. It's only a subsample, which again, I think speaks to how broadly, as I said in my conclusions, that we're not finding an effect. It's kind of not fair to only investigate a subsample when we're trying to generalize across all of the institutions. So I think it speaks to that. It kind of supports the claim that there wasn't an impact here. And I think given that all of the statistics, I didn't mention this in the presentation, all of the statistically significant impacts were on total loan debt that I logged, that there might be something to the fact that it's only finding significance when we aggregate overall loan debt.
Thank you. I kind of want to continue with this thread of thinking about like subsamples and the importance of institutional context. In chapter 5, you do a really nice job discussing some of the ways you might revise Bowen's laws and this idea of sort of prestige seeking in this context. And I guess I wonder if maybe you could walk me through like these nuances of institutional context. Are there some institutions where you think prestige seeking is happening, especially now with all of this money on the line? Like, should it, instead of thinking about this applying to all institutions with college athletics or all Division I schools, are there particular institutions where you feel like prestige seeking might still be like a real thing, even though you don't find it overall for your
Sure.
sort of study? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Great question again, Dr. Chan. I think that, given the fact that I didn't point this out either, that all of the statistically significant impacts were when I used conference as the fixed effect. We went back and forth in the developing the paper that would be a good way of detecting impact. I think it does speak to the fact that these schools have such heterogeneity, right? That amongst the 44 schools, that there are some that are looking to go up, even though I required that they were, just the fact that I had to require that they were stably in the G5 during the study. And, I could look at which ones since then of that subsample have moved on, because there's been, as Dr. J said, when the Pac-12 died, they took a bunch of Group of 5 schools and moved them to the Pac-12, which is not a Power 5 anymore. But I do think that speaks to the fact that these schools at a high level are competing with each other, and some are, as you're kind of hinting at, are more competitive than others and already sit at the top. And we're fighting even more to climb up to the Power 5 level. And I think if I were to really dive into that in the paper and look to see which were, where the findings were in which subsample and what's in individual institutions, I think we probably would see that it's those schools that moved up either to the Pac-12 or the Mountain West, which are the two kind of top Group of 5 conferences. I would suspect it would be those, but that would, that's a few layers down the cake of the findings that I think could be really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's like a nice segue into my last question. As you mentioned, right, like no models are perfect, and there are sort of all these other layers to explore. And I wonder if you could share a little bit, if you were to continue with this work, no pressure, right? But if you decided to continue as Dr. Chick, right, like what would be next? How would you build on this work? Or if you were like, say, if another doc student in the higher ed program came to you and said, hey, I really want to build on this study. Any thoughts about what might be next or what you might do differently?
That's a great question. Well, of course, I tried my own little attempt at what future research could look like. I think, from a qualitative perspective, I didn't do qualitative, obviously, but I think it would be absolutely fascinating to talk to the financial aid directors at these institutions. I would love to know if Coach Saban was calling them and looking to increase their cost of attendance. I'd love to hear that. I always wonder, when these coaches and these people in college athletics, when their careers are done, how much their lips are a little bit looser. So I think a qualitative look at this and the decision making with cost of attendance would be really fascinating. From a quantitative perspective, that's really interesting. I mean, the difference methodology, I think, applies really well to all those other main transformations we saw in college athletics, whether it's the Alston case, the NIL case, the House case. I think, students in my position for years to come are going to be able to apply the same methodology to all of those those policy changes and do some really interesting research. So I look forward to that.
Okay. Well, that's my last question.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chan.
So we'll turn it over to Dr. Jones now, but maybe Greg, you could stop sharing your screen. I just realized that folks might actually want to see Dr. Jones, especially in contrast to continuing to see me. I just now realized I was on the split screen with you, Greg. So
oh, were you? That's fine.
I hope that didn't detract from anyone's enjoyment of the presentation, but
sure. If I do this, do people see him now? Hi, Dr. Jones.
just want to make sure people in the room can.
I messed it up. No, now you're over here. Sorry, Dr. Jones. Give me one moment. Oh, you're getting there.
There.
Hi, Dr. Jones. Hey.
There we go. I do question whether it's good for anyone to stare at me for a long time. That is a fundamental question that we could debate on that. But Yeah, no, it was great to see you again, Greg. So yeah, just a couple of comments and then really not a ton of questions. There's really one area I want to kind of dig in with you, and that was already sort of brought up here, but I'll sort of extrapolate a little bit more. But overall, I mean, I thought this was really well done, pretty strong study. I've been fortunate to be on committees across a number of different institutions. Um, this is as methodologically kind of sophisticated and sound a study that I've seen. You obviously took a lot of time, really thought intentionally about different models, did not try to kind of shortcut different specifications. You were willing to try those out, put them in the model, see what was said. And I also, you didn't talk about it too much in your presentation. You talked about it in the paper, but the effort to do the public records request in order to get the variation and the staggering of when these group of five schools adopted this policy, that takes a lot of work. That I thought about that when I was doing some of my work earlier and said, absolutely not. I am not about to spend time doing that. And the fact that you went the extra mile to do that in order to incorporate some of these updated methodologies around difference and differences is something you should be commended for. Just the effort that took and the persistence when I'm sure you got a lot of non-answers over time and continuing to work with them. I do have a question. I think the bulk of what I would like to spend my time thinking about or talking to you about is the motivation for the study. As you mentioned, you asked whether this was the best time to do this or the worst time to do it. I forgot when you initially contacted me, but I know it's been a while. And as was mentioned by Dr. D, I can't think of a dissertation I've ever been a part of where the landscape, the environment around what they were doing shifted as much as the landscape shifted for you, right? So cost of attendance stipends right now are not even they would not be considered an important part, I think, of a discussion around athlete compensation because the little $250 or $1,000 that they were getting, as you mentioned, pales in comparison to the $4 million contract we'll pay a quarterback here at SMU. So it gets at the motivation for your study and how you want to sell it. So I think at the end of your chapter 1 is when you go into sort of the evolution of the sport environment with the house element, with NIL. And you get to the end, and I forget the quote, but you sort of I remember ending that chapter and feeling like dissatisfied with the motivation that you put into why this study is important. Because if I'm a critic and I'm coming at this, I'm saying this is a really interesting dissertation, and the timing, you can't really help that at the time when you were initially doing this policy was sort of groundbreaking and really interesting. But right now, it's not so much as you're getting to the point of finishing the study. Again, you hinted at this during the presentation, but how would you kind of sell what the value of this study is, given how much the landscape in college athletics has shifted?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Jones. It's a good one. Yeah, I think so much has changed. It is hard to see how focusing on cost of attendance is so important. I think it was you who I've been saying this to people for a year or two now, because I think you pointed this out when I met with you a few years ago. If it wasn't for all these changes, this would be the most important study in all of college athletics. I always joke that to people. And you're right, like so much has changed. I think when the book on college athletics is written, you're going to have pages on the house settlement. You might have a page on Alston, page on NIL, and there might be a paragraph on cost of attendance stipends. And maybe I didn't make the connection in the first chapter as clear as I hope I did at the end.
Mhm.
Probably because I wrote the first chapter maybe 2 or 3 years ago, quite frankly. And I should revisit, but I think I try to get to that in the presentation. This forewarning by so many of decision makers, policy makers, that paying players would spell the end of college athletics. And even though it's how much we're paying them has changed substantially, we're still seeing that those warnings are not coming to bear and aren't becoming a reality. So perhaps in the first chapter, when I'm trying to get people motivated to read the other 150 plus pages after the first chapter, I should really reiterate that, hopefully like I did in the presentation today and in the final chapter, because I just think you're seeing a reflection of what was said back then and the impact of that policy to what's being said now and what's happening in college athletics. I mean, college athletics is as popular as ever. They're driving record revenue, record television ratings. It doesn't seem that paying these players millions of dollars has had a negative impact. So I think perhaps in chapter 1, I should reiterate that.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree. Again, I think a lot of what you pulled into the presentation could go towards the end of chapter 1, where you're able to motivate that while while the policy impact of a finding like this might not be as critical given the changes that have happened, the sort of intellectual exercise in the process of seeing, broadly speaking, what happens when institutions get it presented with a mechanism that could help them in the athletic realm, but could have potential side effects on the overall student body in terms of what you mentioned, loan debt, maybe overall cost and looking more expensive than you actually are, which we know for a lot of underrepresented students might be a barrier for getting into institutions. Kind of feeding into that and emphasizing that as an important takeaway of this study because of the fact that from a policy perspective, no one's going back and looking at that anymore. And now we're looking at these bigger questions about compensating student athletes in a whole different level. So I do think that like some of as you mentioned, once we get a few more years of data and we can do something similar with some of these newer policies, it's going to be really interesting because we shifted from, a $5,000 cost of living stipend to revenue share where it's 20-something million dollars being distributed. And a lot of schools don't have that. Like that money is coming from very often for a lot of schools, I think, as you know, that money is coming from general funds, not necessarily revenue that's being created by intercollegiate athletics. And so you could see potentially what we had been talking about as a potential outcome when those millions of dollars are at stake as opposed to a couple thousand. But yeah, I do think that adding that to chapter 1 would help motivate the study so that when they get to chapter 5 and you come back around to it, you've kind of set that as you're able to make that connection a little bit cleaner. But again, other than that, there's not much I would question other than, not much that I would question, and really just more praise the work that was done. I mean, this was, I think, a pretty complete process. You have some, I think, really interesting questions. And again, the rigor with which you went about pursuing the answers to those questions is really evident. For the audience, they got a piece of it here, but if they look at the whole dissertation, I think they'd see just the amount of work, the various models, and the clear competency that you have in being able to talk about these things. I'll also commend, this is the last thing, and then I'll shut up here. I also just commend the presentation and the oral presentation that you presented as well. So, I think in an age of artificial intelligence and the like, it's one thing to be able to write the paper and get help in writing the paper. You can sometimes get support and people around you that help you kind of sound like you know what you're doing when it comes to that. It's really hard to do that in a presentation format. And so I think here you were able to show not only an understanding of the models and kind of the background and the theory around it, but show a command of the literature, command of the topic, command of the methodology that you were using. So again, just commending you on that. But yeah, my biggest thing was just the motivation and kind of being clear about that. That's really all I had.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jones. I credit the other two committee members who have watched this presentation and practiced with me several times and gave incredible feedback. So they may not be AI agents, but they're just about as sharp as any Claude model that I have interacted with. But thank you very much for being here today, being part of the committee. I know this all started with me emailing you out of the blue, and you responded enthusiastically to some stranger in Boston wanting to follow up your study, and you've been so supportive. So thank you very much.
And I will add my thanks as well, Dr. Jones, for being along for the process with Greg. And certainly your research and your insights have enriched his work. And I think that's evident today for sure. So, Greg, I have a few questions for you that pertain to some larger issues around the study. I think we can all appreciate how people who have legitimate concerns about college affordability, and they see how much money is spent on college athletics, particularly football, people put those two things together in their heads and say, well, the reason it's so expensive is because of all the money that they're spending on football. The research is mixed, as you noted, but most of it suggests, in fact, that there's not that kind of connection. So based on the findings of your study, how would you address members of the public who say there has to be some sort of connection here, Greg, between how expensive college is and how much money gets spent on football?
Sure. Yeah, I think there is difficulty when you contextualize my results, right? Because I'm looking at what happened in 2015. This is before schools started sharing $20.5 million every year with the players, and we're going to see a lot more sharing, I think, with players. But it's tricky. I think schools have, at the very tippity top, there are schools that are self-sustaining. There are I think on average, it changes every year, between 20 and 30 schools that generate enough revenue to support their program. So there are schools that can fund their entire athletic department. But you're right, there's most schools, let's be honest, that subsidize their athletic department through directly student fees. James Madison notably has a $2,000 per semester fee that goes straight to athletics, which to me, I appreciate their honesty. Most schools will hide that in a general fee and do some accounting on the side to subsidize the program. But I think, it gets into kind of a philosophical argument that the research literature tries to address, which is the marketing value, right, of an athletic department, that schools wouldn't be able to get the enrollment that they have or could have were it not for the spending. But it's hard. There's no clear answer because the studies have been so competing. Right. Is the Flutie effect real? Is there really this relationship between athletic spending and overall cost? I think the data is a bit muddy. I think for my study, I would just say that it's bounded at a very specific time, 2015, before there was massive investment. That was a time period where you didn't have these LLCs that were being spun out of athletic departments. We're seeing these top schools create these private entities to handle marketing and NIL for their student athletes. So in some ways, this is a relic of its time. It was before college athletics had to contend with compensating their players. And that I still think it's warranted to be critical and scrutinize athletic department spending, and particularly when we're starting to pay players and compensate them. It's just that at the time period and with a very specific analysis that I had, I could not find that evidence.
Mm-hmm. Well, it could be the fact that, college athletics is so visible. It's sometimes been described as the front porch. Is that the right metaphor?
Correct. Yes.
So if you are literally the front porch of the institution, these activities are going to be highly visible. So people are going to be very aware of what's going on in that space, mm-hmm, and will attribute causality to what they're seeing with respect to the costs of college, mm-hmm, when there are so many other drivers of college costs that may have a much greater impact than spending on athletics.
Sure. Yeah, and you see as schools are trying to get to the top level, that they will inflate some of those numbers. If everyone is familiar, Sacramento State just threw out there that some consultant told them they would generate $1 billion over 5 years in marketing value by jumping from FCS to FBS. So they just recently, starting this fall, will make the jump to the MAC. And in the process, they're paying $20 million to do that at a school that does not have $20 million, just to be clear. And they do that because they allude to the prestige, the marketing power of being at the very top level. And whether or not they're going to see that corresponding increase in applications and enrollment, time will tell. But I think it just speaks to how complicated it is to detect this and how it's constantly moving.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So my next question is about the limits of prestige seeking. And I think it builds on the question Dr. Chan was asking earlier around the major differences between the Power 5 institutions and the Group of 5 institutions. I'm forgetting the specifics of the athletic department budget numbers, but wasn't it something along the lines of 100 million to 30 million, something along those lines? So there's a huge gap between, the UMass Amhersts of the world. I think Amherst is one of them.
Amherst is an interesting example. We could talk about that for a while.
All right. Well, for those who might be familiar, UMass Amherst would be Group of 5, right? Or
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Recently, Group of 5.
Got it. Compare that to Michigan, or some other major program like Texas or the recent national champions, Indiana, with big donors behind these places. So I do want to ask you, though, about these Group of 5 institutions and their prestige seeking, because even though they did not experience an increase in cost of attendance because of this policy, nearly all of them came around to awarding the stipends.
That's right.
So does that reflect some degree of prestige seeking, or at least trying to keep pace with the folks in your own lane? So I don't know if these findings necessarily discount that the G5 institutions weren't engaged in prestige seeking. It's just that's the limit, and you got to keep pace with the other people in your group, so to speak. Yeah. So what are your thoughts around the Group of 5 and how they engaged in prestige seeking based on your findings?
Yeah, so I think I was hyper focused on comparing when it comes to research question 1, kind of running in parallel to Dr. Jones' study, right? Because they're fundamentally measuring the same thing, the cost of attendance. But I do think your question speaks to that schools were competing for prestige, and it cost real money. Those stipends weren't cheap. I actually just listened to a podcast with Kent State's president. He was talking about how no one talks about how it was suddenly, when they implemented it in 2015, I think he said a $2 or $3 million increase to his athletic department budget to offer those stipends, and how that was like to him. He's been president for a while now. To him, that was the real bellwether, the canary in the coal mine of just how much it takes to continue to compete, which is interesting that Kent State didn't win a game last year or 2 years ago. So I think it speaks to, just because I didn't find that the cost of attendance had a statistically significant increase, these are real dollars. All, what was it, 51 of these institutions decided to spend real money to try to compete. And I think it's interesting to kind of compare that to today, when we have the House settlement and schools are starting to pay their players. That these schools are, opted into paying players well beyond the cost of attendance stipend, and continue to compete at the highest level. And I think we're seeing that it's causing more chaos now that the dollars are even bigger, right? Again, we're talking just a few $1,000s back then to millions of dollars now. And I think we're going to see some massive changes as the kind of chaos of paying players unfolds.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Now, with respect to the null findings and the lack of statistical significance, the more I reflect around the parameters of your study, the more I'm thinking we should have been shocked if there was any statistical significance because of a couple things. You had to keep the Group of 5 steady throughout the course of the study. And if there were some really keen Group of 5 institutions that wanted prestige through football, they would already be moving up to the Power Five.
There are some notable ones in that group.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I'm thinking of a couple. So because you had to hold them constant throughout the course of the study, that ruled out some of the real prestige seekers who'd already jumped up to Power Five. So there's that. And then, as you mentioned in Dr. Jones's study, there was a statistically significant increase in the cost of attendance for those Power Five institutions, but as you noted, it was $260. And that kind of sets the upper bound of what was possible in terms of a student loan debt increase.
Sure.
And if you could have found that, it's like, wow, that would have been amazing to find. But first of all, it would have been difficult to find had it been there.
Sure.
And you know, you could say, well, it's either the difficulties of not being able to find it or it actually wasn't there.
Sure.
But look, $260 would have been the upper bound of this anyway,
Correct.
with respect to the second research question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you can certainly say all that, and I agree. But that's what makes the research fun, is to put assumptions to test, right?
Yes.
Because there's too many people who just say what they think based on what's happening, and not as many people who do the analysis at a high level.
Well, and again, the people who often speak with the least amount of evidence behind them are those who are in fact most powerful in those spaces. And you quoted a few of them today.
I did.
So I want to wrap up by asking you to reflect a little bit around how so many of those powerful actors seem to refer to the integrity of the game, while those institutions are often retaining the profits of the labor provided by the student athletes.
Mhm.
So I want to give you another opportunity to reflect on the implications for all of us as we think about college athletics today, and what this means in terms of the NCAA as a trustworthy entity around representing the interests of college athletics.
Yeah, as I was not shy in suggesting, I think the NCAA is not a credible actor. If you take the long view of the history of college athletics, it's just been a history of losing for them. Everything they say back then has for time and time again recently been shown to be at best legally sensitive to court cases and litigation. But I would also say morally. I mean, I don't think we saw what Mark Emmert said back in 2015, whatever it was, that he's so opposed to paying players, and now Charlie Baker, our former governor, as president of the NCAA, suddenly is okay with it. He's more concerned about expanding March Madness and trying to set eligibility rules. I just think it goes to show that nothing is for free, and that the players have had to fight very hard to get a piece of the pie. When we're talking about the number 2 sport in the country, that these players have for years been able to not get anything is I think very wrong and not fair. I think the only reason the NCAA exists today is because of a thing called statute of limitations. The House settlement is costing the NCAA $2.1 billion because of them not allowing players to profit off their name, image, and likeness. And if it wasn't for the statute of limitations, that would have bankrupted them. And I think that's probably why they settled. So, I think what I've tried to do is contextualize my findings to suggest that the same people who had these negative warnings about what paying players would do back then and today are often the same people, and that we should apply some scrutiny and question the credibility of those claims.
Thank you.
Hey, can I follow up on that real quick, if that's okay?
Oh yeah, please do.
That's good. Okay. Yeah, great. So I'm curious about that last point you made, because you made it during the presentation, and that is sort of the question of whether you're confident in the credibility of any kind of future doom and gloom scenarios related to college athletics based on sort of previous findings. While there's a piece of me that certainly understands that perspective and can kind of see where you're coming from based on the evidence that's provided, would you not sort of agree with the fact that this hasn't been like an incremental kind of shift? This is a pretty substantial shift in the financial responsibilities of colleges when it comes to their athletic programs in terms of what has happened with particularly the revenue, rev share. So NIL, that's more you go out and get a deal with Nike or Reebok, whatever you want to do. But in terms of the revenue sharing, so do you contend that you don't necessarily believe that based on sort of previous research, the revenue share and the fact that the budgets of a lot of athletic departments are going to be increasing pretty substantially in order to cover rev share, you don't believe it's going to have a substantial impact on either the health of college athletics or the health of an institution of higher education moving forward, kind of based on previous research? Is that sort of what your argument would be?
No, I think it's undeniable. We're going to see drastic changes over the next few years based on how much is going to be shared with players. My contention is that this is all long overdue. I think if the adults, I don't know who the adults in the room are, but if the adults could have sat down 10, 20 years ago and looked at what knew then what we know now, or if they were honest with themselves, knew what would be fair and right by the student athletes themselves, they would have sat down and figured out some way to bargain with the players. Because we're moving into a space now where this is all being decided by litigation. And given the players' track record of winning case after case in the last few years, I don't know if the institutions are going to be where they would like to be if this continues, versus if they were to just sit down with the players at a bargaining table and hash out all these issues. So I'm not trying to downplay what dramatic impact that player revenue sharing is going to have on schools. It's just more about the moral position and the bargaining position for these schools. I think they would have been better off bargaining in 2015 than they're going to be anytime soon with players.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And just a clarification, because I think that is kind of a separate, the fairness to the student athletes is sort of a slightly different argument as opposed to how it affects the health of the institution. And that's the part certainly I would tend to agree with most of what you said around the student athletes themselves and the compensation that they've earned and deserve. My concern is at some point, it does feel like it's going to have to drift over into the larger institution. And I think you are going to see some institutions have to make some really critical, and they're going to have to make decisions that I fear will impact the larger student body, the part-time student who's not ever been to a football game, but who's just trying to figure out a way to pay for their education, without massive amounts of debt. And like you said, that's evidence doesn't suggest that that is what's going to happen. I do think, though, that this is a pretty massive shift of money as opposed to like a cost of living stipend, which was, a total of $2 million for a Kent State. That pales in comparison to the 20 they're mandated at this point to distribute. So yeah, I just wanted to hear you talk about that a little bit more. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't mean to pick on Sacramento State again, but their president is suggesting that not only are they going to pay this 20 some odd million dollars to get into FBS, but they're going to do revenue sharing, and they don't expect any of it to come from student fees or from the institution. And I think that's going to be scrutinized heavily as they begin play in the fall. So agree, there's going to be some drastic changes down the line soon.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Thank you very much, Greg. We're at a point now where we will need to go into closed session, so we don't have an opportunity for further questions. But Greg, the folks in the room can certainly join you out in the hallway and ask you as many questions as is on their mind at the moment.
Sure.
So we can certainly do that. At this time, we will go into closed session with the committee. Dr. Jones, I'll create a breakout room and we can jump into that. And we'll come back out probably in about 20 minutes or so, Greg, to talk about next steps.
Great.
But again, before we wrap up here, one more round of applause for Greg today. We're getting a lot of congratulations from the folks on Zoom. So I want to make sure you take that all in too. All right. Thanks, everybody.
We're gonna mute,
Mute.
yep, mute and camera off, claps. Urgency.
That should do it. I
And
think
then
Dr.
can you, perfect.
Gosh, okay, gonna do this. Wrong way. I'm trying to run, but it keeps following me.
Oh,
Hey, Dr.
okay.
Jones.
All right, so we're all together. So Greg, congratulations. We have voted to approve your defense today. So on to the next steps.
Excellent.
Well done. So we do have a few areas of edits and revisions that we'd like you to consider, a few key questions. Most of it pertains to the discussion that we had today, as we might have imagined.
Sure.
But I will put together a memo with those substantive issues and share it with you. And then we can talk in more concrete terms early next week.
Sure.
About the specifics around the revision and the timeline for doing so. But just want to celebrate the accomplishments today. It was a fantastic presentation. You did a wonderful job with our questions. And, just give us an opportunity once again to thank and recognize the other members of your committee who are very appreciative of the work that you've done.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you, Jay, running this committee, Dr. Chan for coming on board the day you started. I was recruiting you when you were interviewing here. I was just telling my parents about that, that I pushed for you to get hired just so you can be on my committee selfishly. And Dr. Jones, again, from the very beginning, letting a complete stranger just leech off of your earlier work and produce the study and help me all along the way. So very much appreciate the committee I have. I always feel very fortunate. Thank you.
Congratulations. And again, in terms of next steps, Greg, you and I can check in a little bit if you've got a few minutes to hang out here.
Sure.
But yeah, definitely we want to make sure that we can kickstart that part of the process as soon as we can. And again, a lot of what we're going to suggest in terms of the revisions for the final iteration of the dissertation is going to be very much reflective of the questions and discussion that we engaged in today.
Great. All right. Excellent. Thank you.
All right.
Congrats. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for joining us.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate everyone coming. Thank you. Oh, I see you, Michelle. Thank you. Hi, Lorena. Hi, everyone.
Okay, that means you buy the cheese roll.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Congrats, Greg.
Thanks, Lorena. Appreciate it. Talk soon.
Take care. All right.